narrative. So with Sheikh Jarrah, Palestinian narrative started surfacing internationally, and then the genocide started, and thus the big transformations in the narrative started then. And there are influencers who have come around. Bisan Audi, for example, was Palestinian, well known but locally, and then she became well known internationally, covering the news in Gaza. We will ask about cases where Al Jazeera's Anas al Sharif, may Allah bless him, how he was a journalist, then he became an influencer, and also Wa'il al Dahdur. So, since you all have followers and you have a clear voice on social media as well as ability in journalism, how do you identify yourselves? I start off with you, Mariam.
Thank you. I'm probably going to start by saying that I don't share a lot of the enthusiasm around the so-called influencer economy. It is an economy that has tripled in the last 5 years. It's projected to reach anywhere between $35 and $120 billion in the next few years. It is first and foremost a marketing tool, and it is used by private companies, private individuals, and governments to spread propaganda, right? That's first and foremost what influencers are in service to. Now, make no mistake that within that, digital space, there has been the emergence of individuals, many of whom, as you state, were actually trained journalists. I think of Mu'taz, for example, as being one of them, but, Bisan also, Ahmed, who's on the panel with us here, who became very prominent because as a trained journalist, he was able to communicate effectively information that was needed during that period. But I would be extremely cautious about the glamorizing of the influencer space. Influencers are today being paid, millions of pounds to propagate a certain worldview. You can just look at the amount of money that is being pumped into the digital space more broadly to shift narratives in a certain direction. We know that, for example, Israel spent over 50 million trying to remove the word famine from, the ChatGPT space, 50 million. And so this idea that there's just kind of sprouted up these, well-meaning people who are just helping to craft a new narrative, I think is misleading. And I think we have to be extremely cautious about who's paying whom for what in that space. And I can assure you that those who are being paid on the other side are being paid significantly above what many well-meaning people in this space are otherwise doing to try and counter that. And so this is a scene of warfare. The digital space is a battleground. In many cases, it is the first battleground of narrative warfare. And I think we have to maybe set the scene by establishing it as such.
But how do you define your role in this scene of warfare? But let me translate it to Arabic. كيف تعرفين دورك في ساحة الحرب هذه?
How do you identify your role in this battlefield?
A form of warfare. It's information warfare. It's ensuring that accurate information reaches audiences. And we now work, most of us who are in journalism, in a space where the majority of our audiences are in the digital space. So if today, the recent Gallup poll of 2026 showed that less than 28% of people today trust legacy media spaces. So that trust has now moved into the so-called influencer space online, where journalists now merge with influencers. But the danger there is that just as journalism is being massively defunded, and I'm sure many people in this room are well aware of what I'm talking about, you're simultaneously seeing huge amounts of money being pumped into forms of propaganda to shift the narrative in a different direction. So those of us who are journalists who now work in the digital space, we do everything we can to continue to ensure we can get accurate information in the new medium, right, which is the digital space. But we are up against a huge amount of marketing propaganda by governments and private individuals who are able to define that narrative far and beyond what is then occurring with the defunding of journalism and proper journalists.
أحمد مريم تدق ناقوس الخطر.
Ahmed, Mariam, raises the alarm that all this mobilization of the international public opinion and the volunteers, and there are many influencers who are commercial influencers criticized by Maryam, but they lost funds and money because they embraced the Palestinian cause and the rights of the Palestinian people. Today, she raises the alarm that there is an attempt now to catch up with what Israel has missed in the past 2 years, and that funding put forward by Israel in this attempt, which is to try to catch up to this wave and face it, which was supportive of the Palestinians, so that it will go away and to be dismantled. Your role has moved in this genocide from a journalist to an influencer. What is the role that you can play through your experience? And is there support to the voices supportive of the Palestinians systematically, as Israel now is trying to catch up what it has missed out on?
So when I think of the word influencer, to me, I don't identify with it. That said, it was very apparent to me right after October 7th, because of my experience as a journalist, but also as a Palestinian, what was going to come, which would be a lot of misinformation, a lot of lack of context, and a lot of disinformation, if I'm honest with you. And so in the first few days, I joke about it now, but I didn't eat, I didn't sleep. I was producing 20 videos a day. And I think that was an emotional response as a Palestinian to the erasure and dehumanization that continues today. But that said, what I want to highlight is I very intentionally made it a point not only to create content, journalism, storytelling about the facts on the ground, and some commentary, of course, which would provide context. As I said, the mainstream media and legacy media intentionally on the issue of Palestine and Israel avoids context, because if they were to provide the context, the world would wake up to the horrific nature with which Israel conducts itself, not just against Palestinians, but as we've seen with the Epstein files leak around the world. What I sought out to do was to amplify the voices of people on the ground who were authentic, who were credible, who were transparent, and who were accountable. And quite frankly, too much of the mainstream media lacks all those traits, and I think that is why we've seen the rise of the so-called influencer. I also think it's important to note that, what happened when people say, oh, the influencers are replacing journalism or mainstream media, what changed the Palestine narrative wasn't a sudden moral awakening. It was what I would describe as a loss of monopoly. States and legacy media, as we know, no longer control when or whom gets to share information. And I think it's easy to say, oh, real-time video collapsed the distance that separates us geographically. But, I think when you said at the beginning, your question to Miriam, and I think to all of us, was like, how do we perceive ourselves? I think that's very important. My cousin, who lives in Dubai, which tells you some things about, anyway, let me not get into that. But my cousin told me that he saw me in those first few months when I went to visit them as a resistance fighter. Which I thought was interesting, because I've come to become friends with Francesca Albanese, the legal scholar and the UN Special Rapporteur. And I guess what I'm getting at is, I always saw her as a resistance fighter. In fact, it sounds kind of like cachet, or I'm saying it to be provocative, because, oftentimes journalists, we adopt this idea that, when I went to Columbia Journalism School before I taught there, they told me that, to be a good journalist, you have to adopt a view from nowhere. You have to be objective. You have to not bring your emotions and your experiences, the language you speak, the lived experiences you have as someone who lives in Palestine, for example, occupied Palestine, or someone who is Palestinian and lives in the diaspora. These inform my ability to tell the story of Palestine, but to tell any story. So I guess what I'm getting at is recently in an interview, Francesca was asked why she was sanctioned by the US government, right? And these allegations of her being a threat to the United States and to the world order, which are not just laughable, but she said, my only weapon is a pen. And I guess my only weapon, is the phone and what it allows me to do, which I think counters and highlights the fact that too many journalists, too many so-called journalists have abandoned the most fundamental part of what journalism is. And as someone who's worked for Al Jazeera, both at the TV channel with the stream and then with AJ Plus in digital, and now, as you said, as a so-called influencer or an independent storyteller, which is how I like to view myself, for me, I think, transparency and accountability is what makes me credible. And I'm very aware of that. And I think, when I meet people, and I'll be brief, but there's people here like this 20-year-old guy named Guy Christensen, who I found out about, he's a young guy from the US. He was creating content that was not just telling the truth, but he was informing people about the context around the genocide and the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians as a 20-year-old who's never trained as a journalist. But he was more informative. Even Tommy, former Zionists, their journey, people relate in this day and age to human stories and authenticity. And quite frankly, I think the reason we're seeing the influencer phenomenon and how it's much more powerful at shaping narratives is simply because too much of the media is choosing to forego the fundamental role of a journalist, which is to hold the powerful to account.
نجوان يعني أنت صحفية تعرفين نفسك بالأساس أنك
You are a journalist, basically you are always there when there was coverage from Jerusalem or Palestine or the borders of Gaza. You were on all these fronts. Since the days of Sheikh Jarrah, there have been influencers, activists, or eyewitnesses. I don't know how you can describe them. You, as a journalist, you used to do your job covering through the Al Jazeera's professional lens. How do you view this kind of coverage from the field by others, individuals who wear the attire of a journalist and provide information? Thank you, Rawha. I identify myself as a journalist and I hope to be seen as one, because this is a very big title, a very responsible thing, with all due respect for those who are still in first year media school, who present themselves as media personnel. I know I'm not an influencer, but I hope that my coverage will influence others, no matter what story I'm working on, whether political, economic, otherwise. And from Palestine, I hope we'll go back soon and resume our job. I am, as a journalist, I still never give up on my pen and paper. I still have them with me. But in Sheikh Jarrah, I was there. It changed my view of influences. I used to sleep in Sheikh Jarrah. They really started annoying me and provoking me because they began to be there. They had more visibility, even more than us. I remember a story that took place in Sheikh Jarrah. The local Palestinian WhatsApp groups, one of them was a young man who used to call himself a journalist. He published news, said that the occupation forces stormed the house of so-and-so family and expelled the residents. I was there and that did not happen. And then he started saying that the Israeli occupation forces are using tear gas. I know they stormed. This was on the day that the Israeli High Court was deciding to evacuate these families. And you can imagine the amount of tension felt by people. So I immediately called a lawyer who was following up events. He said to me, no, there is no such a thing. No such decision has been taken, and the whole case is moving in another direction. I sent a message to this journalist. I said to him, where did you get this information? I am at Sheikh Jarrah. He blocked my number. My problem with influencers from outside Palestine who used to carry this news without any verification. There's a difference when we're talking about a journalist or an influencer who is there next to us, who documents things. I call them documenters of events or eyewitnesses, as you said, Lawa, because for me, an influencer can be influencer in the negative sense too. They can do positive things, they can bear witness, they can document, this is good. But despite the fact that my beginnings with them were very negative, now I admit I salute every single one of them, anyone who even conveyed one image from Gaza. And I apologize if I thought some time ago that there were... my feeling was at that time they were in competition, they were trying to marginalize us and they had more visibility. We tried to speak to them that we should be more ethical, more professional, everything, but they did not have such restrictions, so they had more freedom than we have to convey what was happening. After the war in Gaza, I think we should redefine the word journalists, not just influencers, because any human being who considers himself as a journalist, we, like foreign journalists, were banned from entering Gaza. We used to see things but could not enter into Gaza. I think the journalists who did not even apply for a request to be allowed to enter Gaza will be supporting the occupation. They tried differently in Afghanistan and Ukraine, but they had a role they should have played. But every person who held a mobile phone, despite the mistakes which were made, although the reality was more horrific than anything, with linguistic mistakes, professional mistakes, we still say thank you to every single influencer or documenter, no matter how they identify themselves, because if it wasn't for them, then we didn't have known much about Gaza. We're still in dire need of them today more than ever before. We have roles which can be similar, but the responsibility is the same. They can be quicker than us in reaching the location, but I can benefit from the image he sends, maybe develop it into a kind of documentation with more depth. But despite all of that, our roles can be complementary. Saif Abu Kishk, within this context of complementary roles and the Samud flotilla, we see Al Jazeera's camera there and maybe at least 3 reporters on different boats in the last flotilla which approached Gaza, and there were influencers. Why you choose this kind of diversity. What's the difference between the lens of an influencer or a professional journalist? Good morning, first of all. I just want to comment on what Mariam has said, because it's difficult to speak in exclusive language. The point she made is important and relative, but it's not confined to content creating. There are different battles in narratives and opinion making. Historically, political parties, sought to influence public opinion until populations of people, by and large, reached the conclusion that these parties do not represent them. And as Ahmed said, and Najwan said, the journalist plays an important role, but we still see some media outlets which convey fake news and convey misleading information, and the same thing applies to content creation. Content creators are divided into different groups. That's why we are going through a fierce battle now, because there are those who spend huge amounts of money, like the Israelis. They want to restore their image because Gaza exposed their real image and showed them in their true light. You have also content maker and a doer, an actor and an activist. There are those who are activists when it comes to human rights, to environment protection, etc., and workers' unions. When we talk about the flotilla represents to us a kind of a popular intifada, an uprising against this criminality, and we do not want to have their media personnel, influencer journalists. We want ordinary people. We want carpenters. We want workers. We want parliamentarians. And Najwan said something very important, and that is many media organizations have their editorial guidelines and restrictions. There are terms and terminologies which are allowed and those which are not. Content makers, they do not have this, and the true ones, like Ahmed said, those who are more authentic and have more credibility, they don't have links to outside powers, convey a different image. And they also have more contact with people. They are conveying their own personal experience as human beings. So this is another connection, direct connection. People think they are in direct contact. But sometimes we journalists suffer because of these restrictions. It's all for the sake of accuracy. Using the term genocide, this is a very big term in international law, and we had to consult legal opinion to see if we can use the word genocide or not. The same applies to famine. Activists or the influencers, they used to use this term. Sometimes this loses its importance because you cannot use it before fulfilling certain standards to verify its presence. Yes, this is some kind of controls, but there are some media organizations, Arab and otherwise, do not use the word occupation. Yes, this is because of their agendas. Yes, we know what we're talking about is the larger picture, and this applies to content creators because now the popular scene is such that the battle against the occupation has been won. There is no one today who will deny the existence of these crimes, but the occupation tries to reverse this. For this reason, we saw TikTok and the monies Miriam spoke about. They want a different narrative, and that's why they're criminalizing these activists and portray them as people who break the law. Even when we are at sea, different politicians from the Israelis to the Italian government. The Italian government accused the flotilla as constituting a threat to peace efforts.
Where
نحن نعيش في هذه الحقبة ويمكن أن نقضي كل اليوم للحديث عن
the reason that Israel is guilty of genocide in Gaza, there's a lot of misconception around what genocide is. And I think that's deliberate. There's a lot of obfuscation. There's a lot of, not just in terms of when the New York Times tells their journalists. I mean, imagine the leading paper, right? The most reputable paper tells their journalists in a style guide that they should not use terms, as Saif mentioned, like occupation. They should not use terms that accurately describe what people are seeing with their eyes and hearing with their ears and feeling with their hearts. At the end of the day, we live in the age of AI, but we're still human. I want to just emphasize that I don't care whether people refer to me as an influencer or a journalist, and neither should you. Israel is guilty of genocide not because they have mass murdered children and continue to mass murder children every day, which is what a lot of people believe genocide is. Israel is guilty of genocide and has been guilty of genocide for decades because of the intent. Intent is so critical in the context of genocide, and it is critical in the context of information and journalism.
ولكن أحمد أنت كصحفي تعرف هذه المعلومات وبات لديك دور مؤثر، وبالتالي عندما تستخدم هذه المصطلحات تعرف
this terminology, you know what genocide means.
يعني انطلاقا مما قاله سيف لا
Based
يوجد
on what
ضوابط
Saif said,
وضوابط.
there are no guidelines and there are
عندما
guidelines.
يؤمن الناس أو
So when
يصدق
people
الناس الأشخاص
believe
والأفراد أكثر من
individuals
المؤسسات،
more than
هل يجب أن يكون
institutions,
هناك
should
ضوابط
there
معينة
be
وأخلاقية
certain
ومهنية
guidelines
تحكم
that
هؤلاء
are
الأشخاص
ethical
الذين
to
يتصدرون
rule the behavior of
لمناصرة
all
قضية
those
الحق في
people
القضية
who
الفلسطينية؟
are supportive of the causes such as the Palestinian cause?
I'm sure Miriam wants to answer to this, and I don't want to take up too much time, so I'll let Miriam. Well, I mean, the one thing I will just say is, look, there's this perception that, like, I think what the Palestinian case has exposed more than anything is the limits of objectivity and how people try to use both sides in order to, you know, when one side is controlling the airspace, when one side is mass murdering and erasing people, including journalists, and not just including journalists, but targeting journalists, how many of our colleagues at Al Jazeera have been murdered, have been targeted? And the reason they're being targeted is because if you reject the performative neutrality that dominates our industry on the issue of Palestine, then you are discredited. And what I think you're starting to see is people are seeking out those who are consistent, who are credible, because they're consistent, who make mistakes. I'm not saying you, I'm saying as you referred to earlier, you know, people who might not know how to do certain things, but then they're, you know, it's, yeah, I just
You should
think,
wake up now.
Yeah, exactly. Sabah al khair. Okay, on that note, go ahead, Miriam.
I was just going to say, look, I think we've all discussed openly here the fact that information is a site of constant attempts of control, whether it's by governments, private institutions, private individuals, and media, of course, is no exception to that. I think the big thing to consider where we are right now is that I think that what happened with during the ongoing genocide in Gaza was an exception to the rule, which was the platforms that were created primarily for the intent of commercial ends were suddenly a window to allow people who were able to counter narratives, including people who were well equipped enough, many of them trained journalists, but some of them not, but reliant on trained journalists in their cases, to communicate information to wider audiences outside of the controlled parameters of legacy media. This was a systemic shift in how communication occurs in our generation. However, let's rest assured now that those platforms have now been fully wrestled back under control, right? So Ellison has now bought TikTok. You cannot use the word Zionism on TikTok in a negative capacity. Meta, which is where we all share on Instagram, has now put in significant controls to ensure that anything that's critical of Zionism is deemed to be a form of hate speech. X, as you know, is under the control of Elon Musk and turned into a cesspit of far-right hate. And so what you really need to understand is that this was an exception. It was a moment, and that moment is largely gone. They have recognized that the cat was out of the bag, and they have wrestled back control of these spaces. And the danger is that if we now start to regard these spaces as free, just as they have been taken back under the control of those who've always sought to control the narrative, we will ourselves start to believe the propaganda. And just one more thing. How many people in this room have been tricked by an AI image? Right? Right? Okay. Now let me tell you something. Right now in the digital space, there is an avatar of you that exists. That avatar of you in the digital space knows you better than you know yourself. It knows how long you scrolled, what you looked at when you didn't think you were looking. It knows exactly every aspect of your psychology. What is coming are AI influencers who are 100% tailored to your mindset. They know how to communicate information to you in a way that makes you believe it, and you don't even know it's not real. That is coming to you at the speed of light, and I can assure you that if you need to hear something that you think is true from an imam, it'll be from an imam. If it needs to come to you from a girl in a bikini, it'll come to you from a girl in a bikini. We already have evidence that the Russians have been spending 15 million on X to test out these pushing out of these so-called influencers that were presented as activists, ethnic minority activists. They would say 9 things that you would retweet in support of Black Power or whatever else it may be, and the 10th would be pro-Russian propaganda. Make no mistake that the spaces that we were able to use during the genocide have now been fully capitulated, and it would be a mistake for us not to recognize that in this moment.
نجوان ولكن بس
نجوان.
سأطلب إحضار المايكات لأبدأ بأسئلة الجمهور بعد مداخلة.
Calling for the bringing in of the mics for the Q&A session. In this war against Gaza specifically, anyone who follows the Israeli media, he will see that they are going and exceeding and bypassing all moral guidelines because they erased anything related to moral considerations. Haaretz, after 3 months, started saying that there is war against people in Gaza. Haaretz, which represents the center left in Israel. The first news there was about those who were arrested and taken to the Israeli camp. As a journalist, I think the hardest thing in Palestine is to be a Palestinian journalist, to cover an Israeli issue, and to be in Israeli locations or sites. I was committed with the guidelines of the career and the guidelines of Najwan as a person covering a human issue in the first place. Also with my organization, I was committed to Al Jazeera's guidelines and moral guidelines, but frequently I was forced to think 10 times about what I'm going to say on air in order to continue. I knew where I was standing and what am I covering, and I had the statement of the army, and I want to say what the army is saying, yet I'm seeing in front of me what's happening in Al-Shija'iyya, in Beit Lahia, and other places. And maybe this is not the right time to speak about our memoir during this coverage, but we were faced with the most experience in working on the ground with the Israelis. And to say briefly that each live I do in the Gaza envelope, every time we would look for another place because they would pursue us, whether the security forces or the settlers. And this is applicable also in the Lebanon area. So settlers would come to ask, and they wanted to know, is this Al Jazeera's coverage? And this wasn't seen by the viewer. I can see what's in front of me, and there were threats and messages from officials in Israel and spokespeople and followers and people publishing about us all the time. And it even reached weapons being directed against us. My colleagues and I, we had guns pointed to our heads in Asqalan many times, and also in Mtilli and Kiryat Shmone. So the gun was put to our head, and that shows that there are no guidelines in the Israeli sphere. See how many guidelines I have to be committed to. Despite all that I am here. I was committed with all these guidelines. I was prevented to continue my work as a journalist, even though I have not committed any mistake from a career point of view, because otherwise I would be in jail. Despite that, I'm the one who was unable to carry out my job in Jerusalem at a time when the Israeli media would distort, cover up, and even lie. They would make up stories from A to Z out of lies about what's happening in Gaza. Lies. So when you are stopped and prevented, do you resort to citizen journalists? No, even I was unable to be that. I tried. Even before 7th of October, I would be in Bab al-Amud or Bab Silsile covering raids of settlers. I would wait from live to live, top of the hour to top of the hour, and I say, why don't I do anything for social media in the meantime? I didn't know. Ahmed, can you teach Najwan how to do this?
If I may
Yes.
just make one point. I want to give credit where credit's due. As she was saying, sometimes we censor ourselves subconsciously because we want to remain relevant. And I remember when I used to do this, and because you brought up Sheikh Jarrah, in 2021, people like Mohammed al-Kurd, a young guy from Sheikh Jarrah who was displaced multiple times with his family, I will not forget watching him appear in mainstream media in English and shattering the rules of what was permissible to be said and to not be said, flipping the script on the reporters with their lazy questions. And it was people like him who inspired people like me. And at the end of the day, let's not forget, Al Jazeera, for example, if I may say, is obviously not an influencer network. It's a journalism organization. And, in this genocide, were it not for Al Jazeera, and were it not for influencers or young men like Guy Christensen, who a few months before October 7th was a Zionist, or some other people who went on the flotilla who were Zionists. I mean, were it not for this symbiotic relationship between Al Jazeera's credibility, its reach, its reporters, and how influencers and people hungry for the truth and whose intention is to challenge power, even if it's from their bedrooms, even if they're 21 years old and have never been to Palestine, that interplay is very important. So I just want to clarify that oftentimes, because we are humans and we frame things as competitive, social media 10 years ago used to be, it's going to replace journalism, and now it's, influencers are more credible than journalists. Perhaps that's true sometimes, but really we do, it sounds a bit cheesy, but we do need each other. Were there no Al Jazeera, the world would not be waking up to the reality of what's happening in Palestine. And were it not for influencers or whatever you want to call these people who are not journalists, the world would also not be waking up.
أعتقد أننا جميعنا يعني نجرب
I think we all try guidelines. For example, I don't think that morally or from a career point of view, any correspondent on the ground for Al Jazeera can publish on his accounts calls for boycott. But I, as a journalist in Al Jazeera and in Doha, and I don't have an Israeli passport, I can embrace the boycott on my accounts and not on Al Jazeera publicly. I want to engage the audience. We have 35 minutes left. We will try to take some of your questions and diversify also by adding some of my questions. We start off with the lady here, and then Abdul Qadir, then Duha, then Shabuna, in order, and then you. Identify yourself, please. And where do you work?
My name is Hajar Naili. I'm the Director of Communication at Center for Civilians in Conflict. Thank you to the speakers and the moderator. I have two questions. The first question is about beating the algorithm. I suspect that you had to navigate multiple attempts to silence, shadow ban you. Could you share a little bit of your experience, what you've learned over the last 3 years? Any practical tips also for people that may feel discouraged as soon as their content is not seen and they have the impression that no one is listening on the other side? I'm curious also to hear if you had an opportunity to engage with the tech companies and the social media platform on that topic and how the conversation went. So first question. The second question is about moving from the digital space to the decision-making rooms. Have you had the opportunity to sit around the table where decisions were being made, influencing decisions and processes? And do you see your role also evolving besides beyond the digital space to the decision-making rooms?
Do you mind passing the mic to the gentleman? Who would like to answer this? من يريد أن يجيب عن هذا السؤال?
Who wants to answer this question?
Ladies first.
I just meant because obviously you would have experienced a shadow ban. So just very briefly on the two things. So you can't beat the shadow ban. There are mitigations that you can put in. Like I said, these platforms were not designed to communicate the information that we are managing or have managed thus far to get through them. That was an exception. It was a mistake as far as they're concerned, and they are in the process of rectifying it. So there are many people even who've been invited today who are being, removed from platforms, who are having their accounts banned. We even saw Bisan's account shut down on TikTok. So let's be absolutely clear. You will not beat the moderators of these platforms whose goals are to ensure you cannot communicate this. I will regularly post pictures of cats and tigers, and if you follow me, you'll love a good orca, but none of that is going to ensure that you get to see the reach of what my platform used to be, which was in the tens of millions and is now just under 2 million. I've tried every tactic possible. You cannot beat it. Secondly, to your point about being in the room, there is no conversation with Meta or Larry Ellison, for that matter, on the moderation of these platforms because they consider critiques of Zionism to be anti-Semitism, right? This is the official line. So you are engaged in hate speech if you are communicating criticisms of Zionism and therefore of Israel. So that is a kind of red line that we'll never really be able to move past. I know there are attempts to create alternative platforms. We probably don't have time to get into that now. But yeah, just remember these platforms today are used to create a file on you, a file which you now have to submit in order to enter the United States, but which going forward will be used as a file to determine whether you are safe, whether you're irhabi, whether you are whatever it may be. So, I think we have to be wide awake about the function of these platforms.
Safe.
And you mentioned the alternative platforms, and I think Upscroll, right, is in process of providing this space for people who want to continue sharing their content in a way that is not influenced, not controlled, not moderated. So also it is our responsibility, the ones who can speak loud about those spaces, because definitely this goes into this war of changing opinion and shaping the narrative when you want to talk about any cause. And we need to think how we can have those spaces, not only also reaching out to public. You want to mobilize people. One of the challenges we have today in the work that we try to do, that those colonial powers, they use the same terms that we use. They talk about anti-repression. They talk about why you are violating the rights of people. towards other governments while they do the same, while they commit genocide. And then public, people who are not involved, people who don't do activism on their day-to-day life, they get confused. And then you will find people who are marching in the streets to support a certain cause, and they are carrying Israeli flags. And they are talking about the freedom of opinion and the anti-repression against protesters. So we need to be able to reach to people. This is something that there is no way to go around it. And we are in a very competitive space in terms of creating this narrative and in terms of also recruiting people. Space like, for example, Global Sumul Flotilla, when we had the mission in the last summer, around 980 million persons were following the news. We're following the stories of the people. So this is a way of also shaping narrative by doing. So maybe we can also try to include as many people as possible in those spaces to try to mobilize. And I believe when we speak about terms like collective liberation, when we talk about global struggles, when we talk about massive mobilizations, this is an alternative path that we need to move forward, and we need to try to bring people together within those different struggles where we can do that outreach directly.
It may seem obvious, but I just want to point out that, the empire is desperate. That's the silver lining. When they're trying to demonetize a 21-year-old guy from I don't know where, or when they're trying to, make it so that Francesca, a legal scholar who is just doing her job, can't open a credit card, can't accept money from people because of the fear, if not because it would be a crime. I want to also remind you, the system that is erasing Palestinians online and on the ground in Gaza, in the West Bank, in occupied Palestine, is the same system that is going into homes and hospitals and schools in the United States, that is dragging families and tearing them apart and shooting American citizens point blank with no accountability. These are people, ICE, for those of you who don't know, in the US, train with Israel, just like the New York Police Department train with the IDF. I mean, this is the same system that is erasing people, and that is trying to silence, persecute, prosecute, or erase anybody who makes these connections. So it's really important to connect the dots, whether you're an influencer or a journalist. And then also, I had a Puerto Rican rapper on my podcast recently. His name is Residente. He lost a huge brand deal because he spoke out about Gaza. And one thing he said to me in my podcast stuck with me. I just want to share it with you. We often, whether as Palestinians or other groups of people who are oppressed and subjugated and marginalized and erased, we often, in our moments of need and crisis, obviously a genocide is a moment of need, we look to others to stand in solidarity with us. But do we stand in solidarity with people far away from us who are also being marginalized and oppressed? And sometimes we follow it and we know about it, but we don't act. We don't fund. We don't amplify. We don't, so you want people to show up for you when the system is trying to erase you because you're Palestinian? Show up for them.
عبد القادر.
عبد القادر عرادة صحفي بقناة الجزيرة. ربما انطلاقا من موضوع الجلسة.
Maybe this battle for narratives is not something new. This is an ongoing battle, and it's important for us to hear from activists, from journalists, from influencers. What has changed this time around? At least from the point of view of what we hear about the changes in public opinion and the understanding and appreciation of what's happening in Gaza. And most importantly, how can we build on what's been achieved in the last 2 years, especially through the role journalists and influence? And a question to my dear colleague Najwan. We followed through analysis and reports that Israel is concerned, is anxious about the sea change in public opinion, especially amongst the youth in the world, who show more understanding of what's happening. Can we take the mic to our colleague first? Thank you, Abdul Qadir. And even this anxiousness and concern that Israelis have expressed vis-à-vis the protests and some capitals, there was some sort of a deliberate attempt to show that they are, just because you protest against starvation or killing or everything that took place in Gaza, that they link that with anti-Semitism and your approval of what happened on the 7th of October. This may not have been a real concern, but this was part and parcel of Israel's attempts always that they are the victims. And you know, my dear colleague, that during the war, I was almost feeling completely helpless and hopeless that everything that was done through influencers or journalists, that nothing was changing. And I was so disappointed. Yes, we did what we thought we had to do, but for 2 years, they continued. The war is still going on, and this is something we should revisit as how we reached this stage, whether journalists or ordinary people. Now we are coexisting with the idea that a ceasefire has been reached, but ultimately I reached a stage whereby I started thinking, no, what we're doing is very important, and the amount of attempts to oppress us was huge, but it's nothing. It's not comparable to what our colleagues in Gaza as journalists or influenced, but there was a decision to continue. Our office was closed in May 2024 in Jerusalem. The following day, we packed up our suitcases and went to Ramallah. 4 months later, the army came and stormed the office in Ramallah. But when they asked me, why don't you work in Ramallah, the decision taken by the Israeli authorities was not just closing the office, but to ban us from carrying out any journalistic work, even in the Golan Heights and other places. So we had to do what we can, and at the end of December, even the Palestinian Authority banned us from working. A few days later, I had to come to Doha. So despite the feeling of helplessness, disappointment I had, I realized that all the red lines have been crossed in this war. So what are we doing? Why do we have to continue our work? I said in the beginning that I feel that I'm doing good. Sometimes I filmed a poor family in need, and a few days later a richer family contacted me to help them. So I felt I was making a difference. And there was a child who needed treatment, and then later on a family from the Gulf contacted me and offered to pay for this boy's treatment abroad. So despite this disappointment from journalism and our work, now I feel differently. I consider this as very important documentation for everybody who filmed voices, images, anything that took place in Gaza is highly important. But despite all of this, we have to review our work as journalists and ask ourselves, why have all our works together changed everything? Until now, we are not able to. Najwan, sorry to interrupt you. This is your feeling in the Arabic language because we're not going to change the Arab public opinion. The Arab public opinion is on the side of the Palestinians. Ahmed, have you noticed a change?
I think we also have to remember that a shift in awareness and in the narrative, even in what's permissible to be said, clearly, as we've heard and as we've observed, is not a shift in accountability, in the reality on the ground. And that is, I think, the point we're at. One thing I want to just mention, if I may. You know, Al Jazeera in English or in Arabic and other networks in Arabic, even though the Arabs already know about the occupation and Israel's belligerence and brutality. For example, I don't know how many days it's been since the so-called ceasefire, and I find it a disservice to the audience when I watch Arabic language channels, news organizations, journalists casually use the word ceasefire. Why? Why do we use this word? Do we need Marwan Bshara or an analyst or a commentary to say, but it's not a ceasefire because... Why do we legitimize and normalize something that is not a ceasefire? A ceasefire, look at English, the word, or in Arabic it's the same. There is no ceasing of the fire. They are murdering people every day and they are firing every day. So what do we do when we say ceasefire in a news bulletin as a news anchor? What are we doing intentionally or unintentionally? Are we not misinforming our audience? Why are we doing that?
سيف لماذا أيضا تقومون بأسطول الصمود؟
Saif, why are you, as Najwan said, if there is a change in the public opinion, there are more followers, more advocates, but the policies have not changed, the war did not stop. I link it once again that the changes we have witnessed and how we can continue in the future from the point of view of an activist. I don't think we can provide a way to this change because what we're talking about is an accumulative effect. Germany was one of the biggest countries exporting weapons to Israel, and the activists were oppressed. Does this mean that we should stop any activity? If someone says, if you organize another flotilla, what use will that do? We can, they can ask us that you did not reach Gaza. What did you achieve? Yesterday, I reminded Iago that 4 million workers, trade unionists in Italy went on strike. And even the discourse by a right-wing government changed within a week. So the linkage between the activity and the political, we need to escalate. We should act according to what we see. When we talk about the flotilla, we talk about the past, but we're talking about the future too. We invite you as journalists and influencers to take part in the flotilla. I take the last question from Duha. Duha Abu Sumaga. I have two questions. First, what's the difference between an influencer who jumps on the bandwagon with the going narrative and an influencer who helps create a new one? I don't know how the translator translated that for Mariam. Now she is telling you in English what we couldn't say, she thinks.
إذا ممكن نجاوب باختصار شديد لأنه لسه
كان
سيف بده يمرق رسالة وأنا بدي مرق رسالة ونختم الجلسة.
سوف أحاول.
The question here is about what's changed, because it's part of the it's part of the new ecosystem that we're working in. So I see three major differences that have occurred in this ongoing, as you say, war over narrative, which is absolutely not new. The first is geopolitical, and that is shifting geopolitical alliances in the region and beyond that mean that there is more or less, you decide, willingness to confront empire and to confront that both physically and ideologically. That's the first. The second is the loss of trust that has occurred in legacy media spaces alongside the rise of disinformation and AI, which means that people are struggling more and more to identify what is real and what's not. And that last point is the confluence of private business interests with government at the time of mass disinformation. So we'll see, for example, someone like Elon Musk, who also not just only owns X, but is simultaneously running a government department, which is, of course, if you look up the definition of fascism, it's the growing proximity between private interests and the government. The intersection of all of these factors has created a new ecosystem, and I think the real challenge within that is the extent to which, when we see the defunding of, as bad as the BBC has been on Gaza, and I'm sure that no one in this room has much time for the BBC coverage, public broadcasting, of which I was a long time a journalist within, was broadcasting dedicated to a set of values. It was in service to public interests. It was your job as a journalist was to serve the people and to hold power to account. When you defund public broadcasting, which is now happening all around the world, you leave only three remaining options: government-funded media, private-funded media, and the intersection of those, and independent media, which relies on people just like you paying $3 to $5 a month to support people trying to do the job of countering hugely funded institutions. That is a new ecosystem, and I'm not sure that we've done enough to catch up with it.
أحمد باختصار.
I just want to say, I have so much respect for people like you, Saif, and the Global Sumud Flotilla, and all these initiatives. But these initiatives should not be happening, because it should be states that live up to their legal obligations, and if not their legal obligations to prevent and stop a genocide, because we no longer live in a rules-based order. I would love for anybody in this room to explain to me why, after 2 years of genocide, Arab states have increased trade with the entity that is committing genocide. Because in the absence of states doing what is responsible, it is people like us who have to put our lives on the line. And quite frankly, as Miriam said, right now it is affecting Palestinians more than anyone else. But if any of you are paying attention to the leaks in the Epstein files, I hope it's dawning on you that it's going to happen elsewhere. The level of dehumanization and erasure can happen elsewhere. And so I don't know, maybe you know why states have increased, by the way, trade 300% during a genocide. عيب.
أنا معلش بس روعة لأنه آخر شيء حكيت عنه حالة الإحباط اللي كانت
I do not want to end on the note of disappointment, and I say despite that feeling, despite all the pressures, I continued, and I sincerely invite everyone who identify themselves as influencers or eyewitnesses or documenters or influencers or journalists, whatever, not to stop, especially if there are those who try to silence us. Do not fall silent, never. We must continue despite everything, despite all this double standards and hypocrisy and the attempts to control the scene and the narrative. The Palestinian cause is a just cause. There is no room whatsoever to lie about it, even if Israel did its best and the Western world sided with the Israeli narrative. there was a long time until some solidarity was expressed with us, but truth must be told for journalists and others. Safe, and your last message about the flotilla. Before that, Ahmed asked, why should we do that? It's not just Palestine. Palestine is the central issue, the just issue in the international equation, but we are approaching a world without any rules, a world which not governed by any norms apart from the right of might. So this kind of challenge or confrontation is not a choice. It's a moral and ethical commitment, duty. We're talking about a world which is deliberately starving children to death, not randomly, but systematically. And they use Gaza as the experimental grounds for that, to see to what extent will people accept this kind of behavior and witness all these events and keep silent, so that they can take this somewhere else in the world. For this reason, we have to move. For this reason, the flotilla is the coming one. We invite you all to support us on the 29th of March. We really need to link solidarity with the Palestinian cause, with other causes, and make that manifest itself on the ground, rally support, but it's incumbent on every individual to work, to do what they act, to create a new reality for ethics in the world. On the 29th of March, the new flotilla will leave port from Barcelona and the other Mediterranean ports. And this will be accompanied by 2 land convoys, one from Asia, one from North Africa, to focus on the presence of politicians, parliamentarians, workers, and because the reconstruction of Gaza is another colonial project, and they are providing an alternative. It's not a flotilla to break the blockade, but to go reach Gaza and to start reconstruction with the people. Thank you, Saif. We don't have time. I hope that we provided you with a flavor of how we all feel about this new phenomenon, the phenomenon of the influencers, and there are many other questions. There is a book prepared by the Al Jazeera Research Center into the influencers and how it has started, how it's developing, how it's developed from the citizen journalist to be part and parcel of the media scene, and how can the ethical considerations be dealt with influencers to be publishers and distributors of news and advocates of just causes. The book is available outside, and the book is also available on Al Jazeera Research Center's website. The next session will be moderated by Fida Basil. I thank my panelists, Mariam, Ahmed Shahabdin, Najwan Samri. Thank you all for taking part. Thank you.